Excellent. Okay. So welcome to Dativerse number 2, and we are here to kick it off with the first session with me, Eitan Blumin, about SQL Server 2022 contained availability groups. So before we dive in, a few words about myself. My name is Eitan Blumin. I am a senior SQL Server consultant, DBA team leader, and solutions architect at Madeira Data Solutions, which is the leading SQL Server and Microsoft Data Platform consulting company in Israel. We lead the user group. We also lead the SQL Server Radio podcast, where I co-host together with Guy Glanzer, who is the CEO of Madeira Data Solutions. We are Microsoft Gold partner in the data platform, and a bunch of certifications and such. And I'm an MVP since 2020. You can see on the screen my Twitter handle, my email address, my LinkedIn profile, and also my personal website and blog, where I publish various stuff about SQL Server, specifically, and Microsoft Data Platform in general. And you can also visit the madeiradata.com website, where we also have a bunch of content for myself, including, and other consultants from Madeira. One more disclaimer to let you know and to make sure that you understand that everything you're about to see is new. First of all, it's something new in SQL Server 2022. As of this time, it's relevant to, I need to fix that actually, relevant to SQL Server Release Candidate 1, okay? As of today, which is October 7, 2022, okay? So what you see here might be changed in the future. We don't know yet. But this is what we know, at least for now. All right, so let's talk a bit about what we have before SQL Server 2022. So let's say we have an availability group, always on availability group, which as part of its official offering, let's say, it synchronizes databases, one or many, between one or many SQL Server replicas or instances. But the synchronization only happens specifically at the database level. The database is the object, per se, which is being synchronized. But what about server level objects, such as SQL Server agent jobs, logins, server level permissions, linked servers, or essentially anything that is saved in MSDB or the master system databases? So what would we do with it? So before SQL Server 2022, we would implement our own custom solutions. That's in the good scenario, in the best case scenario, because in most cases, this is not even, it is falsely not being considered an issue. It is an issue, especially if you have a DR environment, which could be failed over at any time, and you need to make sure that your server level objects work not just on the primary replica, but also in the secondary replica at the moment of the failover. Because let's say if you have, for example, a login, which is used on the primary instance, but it doesn't exist on the secondary instance. And at the moment of failover, suddenly the applications stop working because they want to use this login, which is not recognized, the secondary replica. Same thing goes for jobs. Let's say when a job has its database context as one that is involved in an availability group, and let's say this job needs to do some kind of data modifications, so it has to run on the primary replica because the database on the primary replica is writable in SQL Server. But if there is a failover and suddenly the database becomes, let's say, read-only in best case scenario, or maybe not even accessible at all if you don't have readable secondary replicas, then the job stops working. It starts failing. So the solution that we would have, as I said, would be one that we would have to implement ourselves. Luckily for you guys, a while ago, we at Madeira Data Solutions developed our own solution, which we titled Header My Jobs. It is specifically focused for providing us a failover solution for availability groups, but also database mirroring, but that's a different topic. But it provides a failover solution for SQL Server jobs. Essentially implements failover, right? So when the replica fails over, so do the jobs per se. Okay. There's a link on the screen. I recommend you would visit that. It's a free open source script, very simple actually to implement. And there's also a relevant webinar with recordings that we already have. It was delivered on multiple events. So you can have that. You're welcome, I guess. Other types of server objects, not so simple to take care of. We'll talk towards the end of the slide about possible alternatives to how to resolve it. But for now, let's focus on SQL Server 2022 and what we have there to solve it. So the new feature we have in SQL Server 2022 is called contained availability groups. What it essentially does is for each availability group that you configure as a contained availability group, it creates additional system databases, master and MSDB, which it inserts into the contained availability group as part of the databases that are being replicated. So whenever there is a change in those master and MSDB databases on the primary replica, those same changes are synchronized to the secondary replicas. And at the moment of failover, each one of them can retain the same server level objects, essentially, such as everything we mentioned before: jobs, logins, permissions, linked servers, and anything in MSDB and master, specifically the contained MSDB and master system databases. Behind the scenes, what happens is that these new system databases are created with a prefix of which is identical to the name of the availability group. So if the availability group is called myAG1, then those system databases will be called myAG1 _ master or MSDB. So when we connect to, let's say, a regular instance, or we connect to it regularly, to the server name, let's say we have a server name called SQL22A, and we connect to it regularly, then we see these databases. Let's see, we have an availability called AG in this case, okay, and we see the system databases called AG master and AG MSDB, and we see the rest of the databases in the instance. But if we connect into the AG listener or directly into one of its databases as the initial catalog, then we would enter the contained availability group, and we will see a different picture because the master and MSDB databases, they sort of like kick in, and now everything that we see as if the actual master and MSDB databases are the ones, these ones that are actually contained. So these two become these two, okay? As you can see, we can also see the TempDB database here. We do not see the model. And we can see all kinds of objects, several level objects that were created specifically inside the contained availability group. In other words, they were created here, okay, in the contained system databases. And when we connect into the contained availability group, we see these objects as if they are normal server level objects. And again, as I said before, when there's a failover, we would see the same objects failed over essentially to the secondary replica. So in a way, it's sort of like we're entering a virtual reality of sorts inside of our SQL Server instance, like an instance inside an instance. In SSMS version 19, as of right now, it's in preview, but you can download it. In SSMS version 19, we have new options in the dialog that for configuring availability group, where we can enable whether it is contained or not. And we can also see this option called reuse system databases. Which means that, let me go back a second. Here, which means, for example, if in the past we had already created a contained availability group called, let's say, AG2, but then we deleted the contained availability group, but those system databases remained. If we, once again, create a contained availability group called AG2 with the same name, it can detect that these databases already exist, and then it will just sort of latch onto them, like basically reuse them. And so if you had previous developments and objects that you created previously, you wouldn't lose them. You can regain those same objects without having to create them again. We also have an equivalent change in the T-SQL commands for creating an availability group. You can use the additional options, again, contained and optionally reuse system databases. By the way, if you do not enable reuse system databases and those system databases exist, they would be recreated from scratch. There are also a few changes in DMV in a few system objects, specifically sysdm exec sessions. There's a new column called contained availability group ID. And in sys availability groups, there's a new column called is contained. So that when you are connected into a contained availability group, you can check, for example, your own session or sessions of any session and see whether it is connected into a contained availability group. And if they do, then which one? Let's talk about what contained availability groups work with, what they support interoperability with. So you can create CDC, change data capture, with contained availability groups. You can set up lock shipping for the primary database being in a contained availability group, and you can configure TDE, transparent data encryption, for database in a contained availability group. The condition for these features to work is that you would configure them while you're connected to the contained availability group, so that those MSDB and master level objects would be created inside actually the contained system databases. Okay, so for example, CDC, it has to create a few jobs. So those jobs need to be created in the contained MSDB, sorry. Same for the lock shipping, and TDE has to create certificates in the master database, specifically the contained master database. It does not work with replication, all types of replication, and it does not work with lock shipping, where the secondary is part of a contained availability group. It also does not support distributed availability groups. So all of these things do not work with contained availability groups. Now, let's talk about what happens when you create a new contained availability group. What exactly happens? So as I said, those two system databases are created, and then all sysadmin logins that exist on the instance level, they are automatically copied to the contained availability group master. And that is it. Okay, no other logins, no other objects are copied. So that means you would have to do everything else on your own. Now, if you need to, first of all, the reason for that is so that only the sysadmin essentially, only the sysadmin is the one configuring the availability group in the first place, so it has to retain access for such users. So that's why all sysadmin logins are copied over, so that they could continue and log in into the contained availability group and create the rest of the objects that they need. At the bottom of the screen, you can see a link to a script in our GitHub repository, which is a version of a script developed by, I think it was Kenneth Fisher. Essentially, what it does is generate all logins and their permissions and server level permissions and roles, so that you can copy and paste those the relevant creation commands and alter commands and so on, so that you could recreate those logins and their permissions in another instance. Specifically, in this case, this is useful for copying non-sysadmin logins and their permissions after you create an availability group. So that's a useful script to have. Now, the question is how login authentication works. For example, what happens if you connect to a contained availability group using a non-contained login? Or maybe you connect into the regular instance using a login that exists in the contained master. Whether they would work, which permissions they would have, and so on. So the way it works is like this. First of all, important to understand is that the connection point per se is the authentication point. What I mean by that is that in your connection string, let's say you connect into either the let's say the availability group listener or one of the contained databases as your initial catalog, that would mean your connection point is the contained availability group. You log into the contained availability group, and now your master database is the contained master database. Otherwise, if you log in regularly to the instance level, let's say global instance level outside the availability group, then your master database would be the instance level master database. And whichever point where you're connected, that is where you would be authenticated, depending on the relevant master database. So if you have a login in your instance level master, and you provide during your connection, you provide its credentials, you would be able to connect to the instance level. But if that login does not exist, that same login does not exist in the contained master, you would not, and you try to connect into the contained availability group, then you would fail, because your connection point, in other words, the master into which you connected, is the master where SQL Server tries to authenticate you. Okay, so let's say that we know which login we are connected with. At this moment of connection, we gain the SID, the special, it's not special, right? But doesn't matter. The special identifier of that login. The S doesn't actually stand for special, but doesn't matter. And now you have that SID, let's call it like attached to your session or to your connection. And with that SID in hand, now that is what determines that's what determines your permissions, because permissions are assigned based behind the scenes. They are assigned based on the login SID. That's the principal SID. So if okay, so if for example your login has I think it's best to actually show it what I'm about to say. So, for example, I have here a demo environment where I already have set up a contained availability group. Okay. In this connection, I'm connected to the listener. In this connection, I'm connected to the regular instance. Okay, and this demo DB is and wide world importance of the databases I have contained. So far it's the same thing that I just showed you in the slides. Now let's say I create a new login called test user 1234 1234. Okay, and I give it, let's say, sysadmin, and I do this. Notice on the connection for the regular instance, the global instance in a way. Okay, and now pay attention. I'm creating the same login, test user, on the contained master database, essentially. And I say I do not give him sysadmin, but let's say I give him, I don't know, let's say DB owner for DemoDB. Okay. Now, what happened is the same login name was created both in this master and in this master. But because I created a SQL authentication login, it was created with a different SID. So if I query, let's say, from sys database, not database, sorry, server principals. Okay, let's just, there it is. Test users. This is me in the regular instance. And let's say I want to connect into the contained availability group. And I will see this one. No, wait, oh, I connected to the listener here. Sorry. I did? No, I didn't. That's weird. Okay, am I connected to, yeah, okay, that's weird. That was not supposed to happen. 273, 273, it looks the same. Oh, maybe because I'm here. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, sorry. My mistake, sorry. I connected accidentally to the contained availability group. Let me try this again. There we go, okay. That makes more sense. So as you can see here, I have this sort of SID, something 0CC6999. And here there's something completely different. 5468, whatever. So these are different SQL logins with a different SID. Now I provided, I gave one of them sysadmin permissions in the regular instance, and to the other one I gave DB owner here, okay, inside the DemoDB database. And that these configurations, these permissions are based on SID. What I'm going for here is that even though, let's say, in this real world, okay, I have this login with sysadmin, or rather with one set of permissions, okay, and I connect using that same login, same username and password, okay, but I connect into the virtual world. I do not gain the permissions from the real world. I gain the permissions from the virtual world because they have different SIDs and the permissions based on SID. But what if their SIDs are identical? For example, this could happen with Windows authentication logins. They always retain the same SID because they get the SID from Windows, not from SQL Server. And it also happens when you create the SQL authentication logins while explicitly specifying which SID they should have. There's also something possible using as part of the syntax. In that case, as I said, permissions are determined based on SIDs. So if I have the same login in both worlds, in the real and virtual world, and they have the same SID, they would basically have the full set of permissions in both worlds. Okay? In other words, sorry, what I mean to say is, for example, what happens if I connect into the virtual world, the contained availability group, and then I use the use command or three-part names to access objects that are outside of the availability group. If my SID permits, I would still have access to do so. I would be able to, quote unquote, escape the virtual world into the real world. Okay? In other words, the contained availability group is not a security barrier. Okay? It doesn't contain physically the session, the logins that which connects into it. Even if, where's the thing? Let's say here I'm connected to the edge listener. Even though my context, my session context is inside the contained availability group, and the databases that I see in these databases are only those that are contained inside that availability group, I can still do something like, let's see what I have. I have external DB, and it works. And whoopsie, and I'm here. I'm inside external DB. Why? Because I'm connected using a login, which, based on its SID, has permission to access external DB. Okay, and the same thing goes for three-part name objects. For example, let's say I use master again, and this is the contained master. Okay, but I query from, let's say, external db.dbo. I don't know, what do I have here? Table 1. So this still works. It's empty, but I can still access it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. To summarize, anything having to do with connectivity, okay, when the difference between connecting to availability group and connecting to the global instance. Let's say if I forgot something here, but I think I said everything. Yeah. Okay. Oh, this one. Something important to remember: the database ID, the DB ID of master, when connected to a contained availability group context, it will be 1. even though in reality it's not. Like behind the scenes, it's not ID1. The real global server level master is the one with database ID1. But if I'm connected to a context of a container availability group, then its specific master will have DBID1. But the same is not true for MSDB. MSDB receives some kind of high ID based on as if it's a user database. Okay, so it will not be what is it, 4, I think, as if it's the regular server level database, system database. And that is something that should be important to remember if you have some kind of logic that depends on the database ID being something specific. So that's important to remember. Let's see, I said that. Server configuration can be read. Oh, that's not 4 part names, that's 3 part names. Oh, okay. Server configurations, instance level configurations can be read even when you're connected to a container availability group, but they can only be changed when you connected to the instance level. The same is true for most instance level, database level, endpoint level, or availability group level configuration changes. You can read them, but you cannot change them from within contained availability group connections. You will have to be connected to the regular instance level. But other operations, including shutting down SQL Server, is possible if you have sysadmin permissions in a contained availability group. So it's not entirely clear cut what is possible or not possible to when affecting the server level. There are some differences, but it's important to be familiar with them. I'll provide links towards the end with more information about that. Now, let's talk a bit about specifically the jobs, okay? The contained availability groups jobs. So what contained availability groups provides us is the ability to always be able to execute jobs on their primary replica. So the jobs will always run only on the replica which is currently active, currently the primary one. And what else? And that's about it. That's what contained availability group does in terms of jobs, and that's it. Yes, even if you have a readable secondary and you can see the jobs on the secondary replicas, you still cannot run them. They are not allowed to be executed. The reason for that is because in order to run a job in SQL Server, it would have to modify data in MSDB. It will have to add a record to the history tables. It will have to change the status of the job and all that kind of stuff. And that would mean that MSDB needs to be writable. And even if you have a readable secondary, it's not writable. Only the primary replica is writable. And even if you try and force it, you will still get an error that looks like this. Cannot start the job because this is secondary replica of container availability group. Start the job in the primary replica of this container availability group. But what if you have a scenario where you do need the job to run only, let's say, on a secondary, or maybe on all replicas of the availability group? Then contained availability groups do not provide you the solution for that. What does provide the solution for that is the script I mentioned earlier, the solution developed by Madera Data Solutions, where you can access it over this yonder link, header my jobs at bit.ly. That does provide an answer to that. You can configure that solution in a way so that you can tell for each job or set of jobs which replica role they need to be running on. Okay, even if it's not necessarily the primary. Okay, So let's see what else. Contained availability group does not. It does not allow, as I said, for contained jobs to run on secondary replicas. It does not automatically synchronize instance level objects to contained availability group level objects and vice versa. So that means after the creation of an availability group, even if you have, let's say, new sysadmin logins, if you have new jobs created at the global instance level, or new alerts or operators or linked servers, or anything that you create on in master or MSDB, those will not be automatically synchronized to the contained availability groups. You would have to recreate them manually while connected to those contained availability groups. And also vice versa, if you create some kind of instance level object in the contained availability group, it will not automatically be copied over to the global instance. So if you need that to happen, you would have to do that manually. It also does not synchronize instance level objects across multiple contained availability groups. So several level objects that were created in one contained availability groups will not be available in another contained availability group unless, again, you create them manually. Contained availability group also does not provide a solution for objects outside of the scope of SQL Server, which is, I guess, it's understandable, but it's important to understand. Even now, we don't have a solution for that inside SQL Server, and that is understandable because these are things outside of SQL Server. Things such as application or backend services at the Windows level, files and folders used by application or backend, or maybe even by SQL Server itself, environment variables, firewall rules, or whatever it is at the Windows or operating system level that you would need to align between different availability group replicas so that your application logic could still work even after a failover. You would still have to take care of these things on your own. Contained availability groups obviously does not provide a solution for that. And okay, so let's see about the current alternatives to those drawbacks. So as I said, that about jobs, we have had my jobs. And in terms of other server level objects, I strongly recommend DBA tools. It's a module for PowerShell with a bunch of commandlets. It's free, and it contains specifically a set of commandlets for copying or synchronizing server level objects between different instances. So you could essentially synchronize or copy server level objects between the global instance and between the contained availability group instance, in quotes, which is inside it. In terms of objects outside of SQL Server, outside of the scope of SQL Server, I would recommend not even dealing with that, because if you have application level stuff at the operating system level outside of SQL Server, that is a problem. There are other solutions specifically for that kind of stuff. But in order to do that, you would normally have to separate between them and the SQL Server instance server. So you would preferably have like an application server, a backend server specifically for that, okay? Or a file server. You could also use something called policy management, either at the Windows level or the entire domain level. That is in order to you can use that to enforce stuff like firewall rules, permissions, and such. But that is totally outside the scope of us as DBAs. There's normally using that is normally being taken care of by IT, DevOps, system administrators, and so on. let's talk a bit, just a bit, tiny bit, about things, new improvements related to availability in SQL Server 2022, besides container availability groups. What else do we have? So we have a new feature called Link to Azure SQL Managed Instance, which allows you to connect directly to an Azure SQL Managed Instance from, let's say, an on-prem instance. Something like similar to an always-on availability group. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's similar. I recommend you check it out if that's something that could be relevant. There are improvements to distributed availability groups in SQL Server 2022, such as a new option called required synchronized secondaries to commit. That is something that was available in regular availability groups until now, specifying the minimum number of replicas, synchronous replicas that need to have their commit completed in order to finalize the commit. So now that is also available in distributed availability groups, and there are also performance-related improvements, such as multiple TCP connections, parallel redo thread pool, parallel redo batch redo. All of these features are for improving the throughput and performance of availability groups. And there is a new column in a backup set table in MSDB called last value restore time. Could be useful when testing the backups in SQL Server. And you can also have much more control over the query store in availability groups. So you can access and manage it separately for different replicas, either for the primary replica or the secondary replicas. There's a bunch of useful features there. And I think that's about it in our topic today. So any questions? Now is the time.
So far in the chat, there are no questions. If anybody does have a question, please put it in right now. Silence. No questions.
Any acknowledgement that anyone even heard the session?
Well, I heard the whole session. It was a fantastic session so far. Oh, we've
great.
got a hello.
You.
So somebody's acknowledging. One second. Right. Someone's typing. 1 second. Oh, it was a thanks for the session. So not a question, but some feedback. Speaking of feedback, I placed a link into the chat earlier on for feedback for all of the sessions today. Everybody who's watching today, please do fill out the feedback. We need to figure out how well the sessions went today. All the speakers want to know how they've done. So it's important that you do provide feedback. So from my side, at least I can say that was an excellent session. It's good to figure out how availability groups or the new contained availability groups work. All seems to make sense to me, right? You pack things inside a contained group and it's contained, so it doesn't share with anything outside.
Yeah. What irks me the most about it is how was this not done much earlier? Well, this was such a sorely missing feature, if limited as it is, right?
Yeah, but I guess at least from my side, the thing would be Management Studio doesn't understand that master and MSDB can be somewhere else, right? So you have to figure all that out, and then the jobs have to figure it out, and all of the permissions have to figure that out as well if it's trying to figure out who you are and where you're connecting and what permissions you have. So I'm sure there was a huge amount of work in the background to make it figure out, wait a minute, where do I look here? Am I connected to an AG, a contained AG? Am I connected to the instance? And like you showed with the SIDs being changed between the same physical person having two different SIDs, that's also a little bit weird. So like now that they have this feature, of course, it's like, why didn't you do this in the first place? But then also my question
easy
of
to
like,
say retroactively. in hindsight.
Why can't they make replication work with this? Like, come on,
That's a good
guys, it's not
question.
that hard.
Seriously, yeah.
Well,
Especially if they have CDC. I mean, CDC does work. So I mean, what else is missing? I don't know. I
exactly.
guess there's some kind of technical limitation that we don't know about.
I'm going to guess, like replication is the oldest tech, right, of those things that we mentioned. So it was all invented before failover cluster instances, let alone AGs or mirroring. So I guess whoever has to touch that code and fix it is too scared to do so.
Yeah, but isn't that true for CDC as well?
Well, CDC just in air quotes just runs like the log reader, right? So it's not that difficult, and I guess they built it newer than replication, so anything that had to figure out running inside the database could be made aware of, hey, there's mirroring or AGs. So I really think probably the replication parts of SQL Server's engine are just so ancient, no one dares touch it.
That's a shame.
Because I mean,
who knows? Maybe in a future version,
maybe
add support for it.
It would be really nice, right? I mean, there's the new change feed thing in SQL 2022. Maybe that could be a replication engine swap or something. I don't know. Just guessing here. That could be quite cool.
Yeah.
So sorry, in the chat there is a question. How about the backup jobs in terms of preferred server? Can the jobs be scheduled as contained?
Well, yeah. I mean, as I said, when you create a job, and while you're created, you're connected to the contained availability group, then that job would be created in the contained MSDB, and it would run on the primary replica of that contained availability group. But that's not just the schedule, that's the whole job, right? It's everything having to do with it. So if you have some kind of different preference for contained databases in the contained availability group and database outside it, you would have to basically create two separate jobs, one inside and one outside. I hope I understood the question correctly.
I hope so as well. I guess if you can just answer in the chat if that was an answer that made sense to you, that would be great. And the thing that I always wondered about AGs while we're just waiting for some feedback or questions, I'm assuming this was all built to make Azure SQL DBs work, right? The whole availability in the background and so on and so forth. So it makes you wonder, with this now being possible, how much could they even roll into Azure SQL DB? Because you don't have agent jobs, you don't have all these things, right? That would be pretty cool.
That's a good point.
Again, completely guessing here. I've not heard or seen anything, but that would be like...
That would be marvelous.
Yeah, right.
If you could have agent jobs inside SQL Server Azure DB and get rid of those pesky Elastic jobs, which are annoying as hell.
Yep.
Yeah, that would be great.
But I mean, already this part with connecting these to managed instance, that already is pretty amazing, right? You can have a SQL Server that is either in the cloud or not in the cloud, and it doesn't matter anymore. That's all sounds super cool.
Yeah.
Okay,
also
so
very expensive, but
yeah,
that's a different topic.
Exactly, right. So the person asking about the backup jobs has come back with, so we cannot have a contained scheduled backup job performing the backup on the readable secondary. Wow.
No. I mean, you could if you create the job outside of the contained availability group. Then it would run normally as any job would now, regardless of whether the databases are contained or not.
Yeah, so it's not picking it up as a contained backup in that respect. It's just seeing, hey, there's a database here I can back up.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
It's like regular, like right now, like in
exactly.
pre 2022.
Yep. Yeah, it just sees it as a readable secondary. It can run a backup on the secondary, and we're done.
Yeah.
Yep. That makes sense. I wonder though, going along that lines, the restore of such a database would then preclude anything to do with an AG, right? It's just going to be, it'll see a backup, it'll allow us to restore a backup, and then you have a non-contained restore of a previously contained database, right?
Yeah, I mean, the database itself doesn't really know that it's
just
contained.
a DB,
it doesn't
right?
affect it directly.
Exactly.
The difference is that those contain system databases, the master and MSDB. Yeah, that's where the difference lies.
Exactly. Okay. Wow, that makes it a little bit concerning in a restore situation, right?
I mean, theoretically, if you have, for example, something inside the database that depends on a server level object, which is created in the contained system database, for example, logins. So if you have, for example, a mapped login that was created as a contained login, and then you restore it someplace else without recreating the exact same login with the exact same SID, then that user mapping would be orphaned.
Exactly. But that's well, if you're running with AD users, then that's a lot better, right? Then the SIDs are not going to be changing.
You're talking about Windows authentication?
Yeah, sorry, AD like Windows logins. Yeah, so the SID is the same anyway. So yet another reason to use AD logins instead of SQL logins, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, it is possible for SQL authentication logins to also create them with an explicit SID.
Of course, sure.
And by the way, the script I previously mentioned, this one, this script, it does that. It creates, it provides you a script that creates the logins with their explicit SID. So that could also be useful for that purpose.
That sounds that's the way to make sure that everything's synced. The really easy way is just use AD users and groups because the SIDs don't change.
Yeah, I'm gonna paste the link to that in the chat here.
Perfect. That's a great idea. So is there any more questions or comments from the audience? Otherwise, we'll slowly wrap up here, I think. Is there anything else that we wanted to shout out? Yeah, if you just pick up your final slide there so that everybody can see there's the additional resources, but also how to get in touch with Eitan after this session. As he said, he's an MVP, which basically means he likes to share his knowledge more than anything else. So I'm sure he's more than happy to answer any questions after the session.
You know me so well.
Yeah, exactly right. This is a thing. Many times I speak to people who's like, oh my wow, you're an MVP. You must know so much. It's like no. An MVP is not necessarily more knowledgeable than people. They just like to share what they know.
That's a good point.
Yeah, they just overshare. We're just the outgoing geeks. So
nice.
if people do have questions, those are the ways of getting in touch with Eitan. Those resources at the bottom as well, really useful information about what's coming in the new version of SQL Server, how the contained AGs work. Wonderful demo scripts from Bob Ward. Regardless of whether you want to look at the contained stuff or anything else, the third link there, github.com/Microsoft/BobSQL. Just go there. There is so much content there. It's ridiculous. Really, really, really helpful to figure out how things work and have great demos that actually demonstrate exactly what's going on with certain features. And then the final one, bit.ly HADR my jobs. That's your code, right? That does the whole HADR processing stuff. That was, you mentioned, also covers mirroring as well as availability groups.
Yeah, it works for mirroring as well. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, don't build your own scripts. Eitan's done it for you already. Fantastic. Well, that takes us almost exactly to time. So thank you very much for your session, Eitan.
Thank you for having me, and enjoy the rest of the event.